Hey guys, what's up? Just wanted to show you a quick rundown of how to make a longsword inspired from Aragorn's Strider Ranger sword, made out of a piece of scrap wood from a hardwood store. So first things first, you want it to be roughly the right dimensions. In this case, you want the blade to be about 2 inches wide and about a 1/2 inch thick. Here's a piece of the actual oak that I used for the blade that was already pre-marked. So I'll make another video in the future going into detail on this, but one of the key factors is the grain on the board. You want it to be as straight and in line with the board so that it's not coming off, because where the grain comes off is where it tends to break. If it's just for decoration, that's one thing, but if you're planning to spar with it or want it to have any kind of strength, you want the grain to line up. Now the board I got was a little too thick, so I used a square that I could set the ruler on, and I traced it all the way down to get a straight line so I knew where to cut it. I've seen people make jigs, but it really doesn't matter. Just do the best you can. Now the first challenge I had on this blade was actually cutting it lengthwise, which is called resawing. I figured I would just do it with one of my hand saws, but I quickly realized that on such a thin piece, it was going to take me a lot longer than I had time for in getting ready for Halloween. So it would be really easy if you had a bandsaw or a table saw. In my case, I ended up using a jigsaw. Didn't have the smoothest cut, as you can see on leftovers that I have here, but I was able to clean it up fine with a plane. One of my future videos is actually meant to show a jig that I'm working on, how to use a circular saw to cut these pieces down the line. So now I'll bring in my actual blade, if you could call it that, with the profile cut in. I wanted mine to be as strong as possible, so I built it with a full tank construction. That's the part that goes under the handle. And I actually drew that center line before cutting it. It's a lot easier when you have square edges. I wanted this to be as proportionally accurate as possible, so using the 2-inch wide blade, I marked on a picture how wide the blade should be at certain points, and I measured that out on my piece of wood, and you can see me showing some of those markings. That allowed me to get the same graceful taper that was really easy to cut it with a block plane. A quick thought on the point. As you can see, it's supposed to be sharper, but I actually don't intend on stabbing anything, and I thought that having it rounded would provide a little bit more strength, which is something that I really wanted to maintain. When I cut the original board in half, I was left with extra pieces that I could use to make the crossguard. This is an example of that, and you can see how thick it was right here. Unfortunately, I didn't film this part, so you're gonna have to imagine, but I traced out the overall crossguard shape, which again, I got the exact dimensions from that picture. Here is the piece that I actually ended up roughing out. There are many ways that you could do this part, drill it out and then chisel out the remains, but I wanted it to be extra snug and tight, so I chose to do it in 2 pieces, chisel it out and glue it together. So I'm just pointing out the ricasso and the shape that I wanted to have on the crossguard. Let me put this in a vise and show you how well it fits together. Look at that, like a glove. So the audio doesn't line up here because my explanation before was really difficult to understand. But the main point is, even though I've got a Dremel in the background that probably would have been easier, I had a better time with the chisel. This blade is pretty dull, but still it was able to help me get the shape that I wanted, and whenever I can use a blade, I'll opt to do that. Again, sharpen those things and it'll save you a lot of time. About this time, I was wishing that I had some spoon carving knives because it was pretty tough to get in those tight curves with the bench chisel, but I made it work. For the edge of the blade, I didn't want it to be sharp, but I did want it to have some form, and so I decided to round it off. It can be pretty easy to get lost on these longer pieces as you're carving into it, so I decided to use that same trick with the square and trace a line down the edge. It was about a 1/2 inch in, and then I centered the blade on the edge, and I used those 2 lines to help guide my work. So here's the block plane that I used to form the edge, and really not much to it. I just scraped down until it was the shape that I wanted it to be. If I had a spoke plane, I probably would have used that, but this block plane worked great and was really nice on that longer edge. It just gave a nice, beautiful, crisp line. This was probably my favorite part of the build because at this stage is when it went from a sword-shaped board to more of a wood sword. Other than making the edge, using the plane also allowed me to take some of the weight off and also try to fix this warp that came after I resawed it. The original board was straight, but for whatever reason it picked up a warp. So for the finishing work, I used this cabinet scraper. You could sand it, but I just like cutting tools more, and I felt like this gave it a sufficiently glossy surface. I also love the little shavings that you get when you use the cabinet scraper like this instead of the annoying sawdust. Now we get into the biggest problem I had with this build, which was the gluing on the handle. I made a few mistakes on here, things that I'm going to fix in the next sword that I make. First of all, when I glued the pieces of wood together, I didn't use the flat sides. I used the sides that I had cut, and so there were some gaps in there. And beyond that, I tried doing it all at once. I wonder if I would have had more success gluing one side onto the other. You'll see that there are some gaps in the side, but anyways, I glued it on, cut out the basic shape, and I was loving how it was starting to finally look like a sword and it was getting the balance right. At this point though, I just started to cut it down. I thought that it would be easiest to cut with this saw along the side and chisel pieces out, which it was, but then that created some problems for me later down the line. So here's a very roughly shaped handle. It was harder to carve with the crossguard in place than I anticipated, and the glue that I used was so thick that it did not cover all those gaps. So I made a paste with the sawdust that I put in there. It helped, but again, I think the glue was too old. I ended up buying some new one after this just because of that. So to help cover up those gaps and also to pull it all together, I decided to cover it with some extra leather that I had. I cut out a strip just shy of fitting together, and then I sewed it together with some heavy-duty nylon thread that you'll use for upholstery. I was really pleased with how well it pulled things together, both literally and aesthetically. So there's really no right or wrong way to do this. I just used an improvised crisscross pattern. I wanted most of the stitches to be hidden, and I think it did a good job at that. Well, here it is, the finished sword. I really love the colors and how they came together. I finished the blade with a beeswax and the handle with Danish oil. I was hoping for more of a contrast, but I was happy with how it turned out. I wanted to really go into it being wood because I was afraid that if I tried to paint it to look like metal, it would look more fake. It's hard to tell on the camera, but the blade does taper all the way to the point in both dimensions. And you can see how I was able to use that to straighten the blade. Here I am swinging it around. Don't mind me, I'm a huge dork pretending I know what I'm doing. But I really love the feel. It just, when you pick it up, you want to swing it around. The balance is right, it's nimble, and feels really sturdy. You can see here about where the balance is. It's a little further down the blade than I intended, but overall, I'm really happy with how it turned out. And don't worry, that's my thinking face, not my grumpy face. Well, here's how it all turned out on Halloween. The whole costume was really fun to make, but especially the sword. I really appreciate you sticking through and watching this whole video. I know it's not the smoothest, but it was my first one explaining how I've made something, and I plan to make a lot more for all the projects I have. So if it was worth your time, please like and subscribe, and we'll see you around.